moms and dads. So we're going to head now into our new series, which is Judges. And so it follows on really nicely, the books of the Bible, Joshua, and then straight into Judges. And just one thing for you to note about the book of Judges is that there's a cycle, a pattern that takes place throughout the book of Judges, which is that the people, Israel, rebel. They fail God, they sin, and so God punishes them. And he does this by using other nations to defeat them in battle. And then Israel cry out to God for mercy. God raises up a judge, a rescuer in the form of a judge. And then the next step is that Israel experience peace. But as soon as that judge dies, they land up going back to the beginning where they rebel against God. And so that's a cycle. We're going to look at it on Sunday morning with the children. And it's just good for you to bear that in mind. Won't you go and read Judges chapter 2 from verse 6 to chapter 3 verse 6, and then also chapter 3 verse 12 to 30, just to give yourself some bearing for our lesson on Sunday. Just a few notes on the passage is that in chapter 2 verse 3 to 6, what we need to see is that it only took one generation for Israel to forget and to forsake the Lord. This introduction provides an overview of the book of Judges, summarizing this recurring cycle that I've just spoken about, that began with the death of each new judge. Israel was unfaithful. God used their enemies to punish them, so they would cry out to be rescued, and when they did, God raised up a judge to rescue them. The judge ruled for a period of time and then died, and Israel were unfaithful yet again. And each new cycle left the next generation even more corrupt than before, heading in a downward spiral. Israel's inability to remember God's faithfulness or to recognize him as their one true God, as they promised to do, left their covenant with God in ruins. However, despite their unfaithfulness, what we will see is that God remained faithful. His ongoing judgment and rescue, they were both signs of his commitment to call his people back to himself, rather than a failure to fulfill his promise to give them a land and victory over their enemies. So then this week, we're going to be looking at our first judge. It's in chapter 3, verse 12. So verse 12 to 15a, the story of Ehud begins the second cycle in the book of Judges, with Israel doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and God giving them over to their enemies. The Moabites were the descendants of Lot, and they had deceived Israel during their wanderings in the wilderness. Previously, they had conspired with the Midianites. This time, it was the Ammonites and the Amalekites. The city of Palms was a name for Jericho, which was the first city conquered by Israel under Joshua, which we looked at in our last series. And so when the Israelites cried out to God because of their oppression, he faithfully sent them a deliverer. So have a look in verse 15, the end of verse 15 to verse 19. What we're told is that Ehud was a left-handed man. He was literally unable to use his right hand, either through disease or disuse. And he would have been considered weak, so posing no threat to the king. Swords were usually worn on the opposite leg to the dominant hand. These are quite interesting facts that you can share with your children on Sunday. They probably won't come in with the kids on Sunday, but whenever I do teach it to the kids, they love these little facts. And interestingly, when I quiz them on it, in years, even my own children, those are the details they remember, is that Ehud was a left-handed man and that swords normally most people were right-handed, so the sword would have been on his left leg. So those are great details to share with your kids as you go along. So Ehud was therefore able to conceal a custom-made short sword on his right thigh. Ehud's mention of a secret message to the king must have appealed to Eglon's pride. So it's possible that he thought that Ehud had more tribute to give to him, and so he unwisely sends his servants away. Then verse 20 to 25, Ehud's disability made the surprise attack possible. So he disemboweled Eglon, and the smell must have led the servants to believe that Eglon was relieving himself. Another fact that the children love about this story is that Eglon was obviously in the room, sent his servants away. Ehud comes and stabs him, but no one goes in to check because they think he was on the toilet, which is the truth of the story, but the children absolutely love those details. Then verse 25 to 30, the time that the servants took to overcome their embarrassment then gave Ehud an opportunity to escape and to rally the people to then fight against Moab. He did not claim to have delivered Israel himself, but rather he told the people that God had done so. The final part of this cycle ends with 80 years of rest under Ehud's rule as judge. So what we see here is that God showed his faithfulness throughout the book of Judges, both in his judgment and in his rescue. He faithfully disciplined his people in order to bring them to repentance, and then faithfully raised up an unlikely rescuer to deliver them when they did. By contrast, his people were so unfaithful that even their repentance was short-lived, never extending beyond a single generation.